we have lost access to information that is not aligned with what we think, because the news feed that you will receive on your social media are exactly aligned with what you want to hear and your beliefs, your set of beliefs. And therefore, we have lost the ability to understand that there are other data, other information out there that says things completely different. And we have lost the ability to disagree because we are just surrounded, we are just operating in safe space where nobody disagrees with us. Decision makers operate in an ivory tower and tend to be surrounded by sycophants. And it creates huge disruption about the kind of information that they actually have access to. And breaking that is absolutely essential.
Hello and welcome to the Intelligence Advantage podcast, where we talk to the movers and shapers in the investigation and intelligence space. My name is Gary Miller. I've been an investigative lawyer for nearly half a century, and I'm also the chairman of the IFG, a network of international investigative and asset recovery lawyers. I'm delighted to introduce and be joined today by my good buddy, Thomas Eymond Laritaz, founder and CEO of Highgate. Over the past 2 decades, Thomas has advised presidents, prime ministers, and business leaders in some of the most sensitive political and corporate situations, and now helps governments and companies navigate high-stake disputes through strategic intelligence. He also happens to be a pretty good referrer of Indian restaurants to me. So we're going to add that to your CV. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you, Gary.
Okay,
Nice being with you.
It's lovely to have you. I'm going to get straight into it. You have advised presidents and prime ministers and some pretty senior corporate leaders. When you first walk into a room with them, what is the first thing you do or the first thing that you say?
Well, the first thing is that I try to listen to them and try to understand the type of issues that they are facing. I think if you want to help someone, you need to show respect, interest, and they need to have the feeling that you care for the type of issues that they are facing, and you fully understand, and you don't try to sell solutions without having understood the problem.
And how, I'm sure you do. You and I have not yet, but please, inshallah, we will be doing it in the not too distant future in a room with clients together. But what's your room reading? What's your body language and your people readings? What are they like? Are you good at assessing and pretty astute at assessing the kind of character someone is that if you've never met them before?
Well, that's you need to ask other people about me. I don't know, Gary.
Well, I have this habit that I don't know whether you do, of when I go in, of scanning a room, and I've already got, it's a kinetic thing. I already know by just feeling the energy that comes out of the people, whether that's going to be a tough cookie to crack or, now, of course, you get it wrong sometimes, but I don't know. I kind of feel that, but I'm not going to.
No, of course, no, but that's obvious. I mean, being able to read the room and be able to, I think the most important thing is to be able to connect emotionally with the other person. We always make the mistake to think that the discussions we are having are purely rational discussion. And what matters is what is the vibe, what is the emotional connection, and what is the body language, and how you can create ease and mutual understanding and respect. That is essential. So, and if that is already established, then this is a foundation to then talk about content.
And this question or this topic of emotional intelligence is what everyone's talking about, certainly in this day and age, because everyone, A, has got fed up talking about IQ, But more importantly, everyone realizes now how lacking some people are, how some people lack any emotional intelligence at all. Can you teach emotional intelligence, or do you either learn it, have it? What do you think?
Well, I think it's like for everything, there is a part of inner talent. There's a question of awareness. There's a question of learning, and there's a question of practicing. So it's like if you want to be good at a sport or at a musical instrument, you need to have some already something in you that allows you to do it. I tried for 10 years to play the violin. It was an absolute disaster. So I put a lot of hard work on it, but I didn't have the minimum talent required to produce any audible sound.
Any pleasant audible sound, Thomas?
Well, any kind of.
10 years is
as a child, my parents were putting me in the bathroom, pretending that I needed to be in front of a mirror to check the position. It was just to use a soundproof tactic.
I see. That's very smart. Now, 10 years, that's already told me something. I probably knew it anyway from time I've spent with you. You're a kind of determined fellow. But 10 years, it's a long time to do it before you realize that you were rubbish.
Well, I mean, if you wanted a proof of lack of self-awareness, you've got it. I think it is coming back to the question of emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing is you need to have interest and empathy. If you don't care about the people, you cannot have good emotional intelligence. And I think that for me as a consultant, and the way I select my consultants is that I only want to work with people who are absolutely passionate about helping others, about servicing others. If you don't have the drive of trying to help your fellow citizens and trying to help your clients, then it doesn't work because people immediately feel it. If people sense that you are there for your own self-interest or for your own money, it will never fly. You must genuinely be interested in helping them. And that's the foundation.
And I don't know whether you feel the same way that I do, but there are certain places in the world, which I won't necessarily mention, where when you're dealing with people, you know it's all about the money. It's nothing else. It's either you pay the price for what they are either demanding, the price they're demanding from you. So there are not that many people that guide themselves sadly, with a genuine desire to help. I mean, do you come across a lot of like-minded professionals like yourself who genuinely want to help and are not just selling something for the commercial value?
I think you can only sell successfully if you are also at the same time interested in helping the people. The two go hand in hand. If you just want to make money, it will not fly, at least in the service industry.
Or, which I think is the same thing, is that it won't be a relationship, it will be a one-stop shop, basically.
Exactly. And all the people that I know who work as very successful lawyers or intelligence providers or consultants, the people who have really made it and who are outstanding, they all have in common a passion for servicing and a passion for helping others and finding solutions.
And are you able to think of somebody, a mentor or other person who you, or maybe more than one, that you've met along the way that has had a profound impact on you and the way you think about life generally, but also you've come away thinking, my God, that person's just got that fairy dust?
Yeah, I've been extremely lucky to work with some senior people who have told me a lot throughout my career, and I could name half a dozen people who have profoundly had an impact on me and the way I was working.
Do you feel comfortable in naming one or two of them, or is it too confidential?
No, I can name them when But that will oblige us to go through some elements of my career, which I'm not sure is the most interesting thing. But when I started my career, I was an engineer, and I was working for the French government and for the French Ministry of Environment. And I was in charge of controlling industrial plants in France for their impact on their environment and the risk. And I was heading a team of about 40 people in southwestern France.
Right.
And I've learned a lot from the two people who were leading the Ministry of Environment that practice at that time. And you had a perfectly a tandem between the general director, who was a very inspiring figure, disruptive, and thinking several years ahead. And he was working hand in hand with an extraordinary lady who was able to translate this vision into day-to-day operations. And these two were aligned with the vision, but you could not find more contrasting figures and approaches.
Can you explain that a bit more, or at least tell me what it is, or would you be giving away a state secret and you have to shoot me? I mean, I'm always fascinated when you've got a situation and you've got such creative people, and someone said, "Why don't we turn the switch that way instead of that way?" And suddenly something else magical happens.
My experience is that to run an organization, you need a very different sets of talents. And you need to have people who are disruptive, and you need to have some people who are, on the contrary, working within the system to make the system work. And these two profiles are fundamentally different. And whenever you are in a situation when these people can work hand in hand, this is where actually a vision can translate into action. Because if you just have disruptive visionary leadership,
Yes,
it is rare that this actually translates to an organization. And if you just have a very good manager without the visionary disruptive vision, then it's a status quo. So if you want to move an organization and create something new and innovative, you need both sides of the coin.
So when you were thinking about, I haven't left your background as an engineer because I'm fascinated with anybody that's got a science and a mathematical background, because most of us lawyers, as you know, are innumerate and find the scientific part of the world a little bit difficult to cope with. But so when you started when you started creating, or you were thinking about Highgate, you knew, using those two balancing things, you knew that you needed a manager to balance out your disruptive thinking, or you were the manager and you needed disruptive thinkers, or what? How did you go about recruiting the very first people that you needed at Highgate?
So I brought my COO 2 years after the creation of the company. And she is the one who is the real manager internally. I was always the disruptive thinker, and I don't think I'm a very good manager. And I needed somebody to be very good where I am weak.
Yeah.
And being aware of your own weaknesses, I think, is very important, because then you try to work with the right people who can compensate that.
So really interesting, because I think, of course, not for me to say, but I kind of think I share a similar lack of skill set in managing. I'm very good at, I think leading is different from managing. I'm very good at thinking of an idea and saying, right, that's what we got to do. But over the years, there have only been 48 of them that I've been in business. I do realize that there's some feedback in that you just don't really have the skill set of bringing those 68 people behind you. So is that something you learned about yourself quite early on, that managing was not your best suit?
Yes, yes. Well, I think life is a self-discovery process, and as you get older, you start to learn about where you're good at and where you're less good at. And once you understand where you're less good at, you're looking for talents to be able to fill the gap. And I think any successful organization is an organization where you have this right balance and right diversity of talents, so that you cover all the grounds.
So I am going to dive back now into engineering. When you were at university, that's where you first started engineering, or is there an engineering background in the family, Thomas?
My father had a scientific education.
I see.
Well, France is a very different system than the US or the UK. If you're good at school, and especially if you're good at math and physics, a lot of people would do engineering schools,
I
which
see.
is what I did. And then most of these people end up being bankers or consultants or managers, and very few end up having a true engineering job. I mean,
Right.
the city of London is full of French bankers who are there because they know how to count, and that's not usually what people learn at Oxford and Cambridge, where they read classics or literature or Latin or history. So so I became an engineer because I was good at school, especially in math and physics, and um, and I discovered a passion, and I had a passion for environmental science. So I graduated as a mining engineer, specialized in environmental science,
Wow.
um, and I wanted to work in the field of environment. And at that time, we're talking about more than 30 years ago. I realized that the only field that was making sense for me was to work for the government, and I was blessed to be able to be taken to a fast track program for becoming a high-end French civil servant. So I joined the Ministry of Environment, and then I worked for the Prime Minister in Paris.
Wow. So you were how old when you were working for the Prime Minister? It sounds pretty young.
I was 28.
So
Yeah.
that's quite. And you were with the Prime Minister's office for how long before you moved on?
So I worked for the Prime Minister's office for 2 years, and my job was to manage interministerial coordinations on European affairs. So you have a negotiation in Brussels, and you need to have all the different ministries agreeing on what is the position of the French government. And so that was my job. So that was to bring the people around the table, find a compromise. When there was no compromise, take a decision and establish the position of the French government and give instructions to our ambassador in Brussels. And I was doing a lot of work in the field of environment. So the first emission trading system in the world, the CO2 emission directive,
Right.
I established the position of the French government on that, and was also working on the liberalization of the electricity market, of the gas market, on the research program, energy policies, space policies. So I did that for 2 years, and then there was an opportunity to send a French civil servant to Bulgaria to be an advisor to the Bulgarian Prime Minister to help Bulgaria join the European Union. And I was interested in a bit of adventure, and so I volunteered and was selected both by the French government, who was paying for this position, and by the Bulgarian Prime Minister. And that's where I started spending some time in Eastern Europe.
Wonderful. And dare I say you picked up some odd phrases of Bulgarian while you were there, or are you fluent now?
No, I'm not fluent. I'm not fluent.
But you learnt enough to get by. And so what role did the gathering and analyzing intelligence play in that part of your life when you were advising the Bulgarian Prime Minister?
So I would not say that I was working with neither the public intelligence or private intelligence industry. But again, what I think is very important when you advise a decision maker is to be able to listen and not to provide an answer before having understood the problem. And a lot of the leaders suffer from operating in an ivory tower. And all of us tend to end up like that. And that leads to bad decisions simply because we have bad data. So being able to understand the environment around you, being able to understand what are the concerns of the other side, what are the expectations, is absolutely key. So in a way, that's soft political intelligence.
Right.
And that was always something that I was very much interested in. Because if you put the wrong data in the software, you get the wrong results.
And it seems to me, but I've never been personally in that position, that when you're at that level of advising prime ministers or government ministers, this whole issue of, I don't know about covert intelligence, but the kind of intelligence that only governments collect and analyze is absolutely critical to be able to do your job as a prime minister. You need to know those things that are well beyond what you pick up in a newspaper, right? So that must be a symbiotic relationship with the intelligence agencies when you are at that level of government.
You would expect it. The reality, I think, is fundamentally different.
I see. Wow.
The reality is that a very large number of organizations, I'm not talking here about Bulgaria at all, but my experience working with a dozen presidents or prime minister and many CEOs and private clients, is that decision makers operate in an ivory tower and tend to be surrounded by sycophants.
Wow.
And it creates huge disruption about the kind of information that they actually have access to. And breaking that is absolutely essential. Bringing a different perspective, speaking truth to power is essential. I'm reading at the moment a book called King of Kings, which is about the fall of the Iranian Shah in 1979, 78, 79. And it is absolutely extraordinary to see how the US government had absolutely no idea about the discontent inside Iran about the Shah. They were completely blindsided. And the Shah himself had absolutely no idea. So, and they had the largest Secret Service operations between Western Europe and China was in Iran for the US. Right. And the Shah had an extraordinary secret police. But these two intelligence bodies provided completely distorted information to the decision makers.
Consciously
and unconsciously, wishful thinking, unconscious bias, laziness, being a sycophant, everything combined. And this is something that we are seeing again and again and again in private organization, in public organization. So having the courage to look outside the box and break the wall of silence about there's an issue here. Have you considered this perspective? Is absolutely essential.
So would you share the view then that, bearing in mind that most people, as they climb whatever ladder it is, a governmental or a corporate ladder, whether it's a law firm, whether it's a corporate body, whether it's listed or not, by definition, you recruit and pick the people that you like and who either you recruit in your own image or people that you like. Is it then inevitable that you end up with that scenario where you're surrounded by people who you like, they like you, they want to, as it were, reaffirm that relationship. And so it's almost a self-perpetuating circle that sooner rather than later, that person is going to surround himself by yes men and yes women.
So I think that's part of what is happening is the yes men and yes women. Part also is the fact that we most of the time are not aware that we operate in completely different information bubble than the other people. Look at the debate on US politics. Take a Republican voter, take a MAGA voter, and take a Democrat voter. The information they consume is just completely different. Completely different. And this leads them to completely different conclusions about how the country should be governed and what should be the priorities. You and I live in different information bubble. We have access to different data on our social media feed. We read different newspapers. We talk to different circle of friends. And the result is that we develop a vision of the world and a vision of our business where we're looking at different things. Simply because we have enormous blind spots. And being aware of these blind spots and proactively trying to understand what is there is absolutely essential. Now, most of the work I'm doing with Highgate is about disputes. So we're helping people resolve disputes.
Right.
And disputes against government, dispute against other corporations, against other individuals, shareholder dispute, corporate dispute, family dispute, investor state dispute, you name it. 90% of the cases, our clients comes with an idea about what is driving their opponents. In most cases, our clients wrong because they believe their opponents live in the same information bubble as they do. My job is to convince the other side to act differently and to do it and then to negotiate. But the first thing that I need to understand is in which information bubble the opponent is operating. Why is he acting in such a way? We resolved a dispute of several $100 million for US investment fund against the governments. And when we started working for the client, and the client tried to seize sovereign assets, they had won an award. They tried to seize sovereign assets all around the world, and they were not, from a legal perspective, they were not able to make any breakthrough. And the government, for more than 10 years, refused to pay. So the client came to us and said, could you help us? And we started working with intelligence firms, and not to try to locate where the sovereign assets were and try to seize them. This had been tried and led nowhere. Our approach was very different. I wanted first and foremost to understand why the government was refusing to pay. And we understood. And they were refusing to pay for 3 reasons. Very simple. The first reason is that everybody in that government thought that they were winning the legal battle. So the Minister of Justice, who was in charge of the dispute, was lying to the president, to the prime minister, to the rest of the government, to the elites, and to the local media. So why would they pay my client if everybody was convinced that they were winning the lawsuits, where they had lost everything? So if you don't understand,
how did you find out that was? So you need intelligence to find out, investigations to find out what he was thinking, correct? Or it was pretty obvious?
I needed intelligence, and I used intelligence, and I used very high-level people that I sent in the country to understand what he was telling the president, the prime minister, the rest of the government, and the elites.
Right.
And once we found that he was actually systematically lying. The second thing we found is that we understood why he was lying. He was lying because he had an economic interest in the continuation of the disputes, because he was taking a cut. So the more he was paying lawyers, the more he was making money. So we then understood the rationale. And then we also understood that in addition to all these lies, the government was paying no cost whatsoever for the continuation of the disputes. So there was no downside. So first, the government was ignorant that they had to pay money because they saw that they didn't need because they were winning. And second, there was no downside for them not to pay the money.
And that's because the lawyers were doing it for nothing, or what?
Oh, the lawyers were costing them a fortune. Actually, they spent more money in legal fees than they would have spent in paying my clients.
So when you said, maybe I've got myself confused, when you said there was no cost to them continuing the litigation, you didn't mean legal costs.
I didn't mean legal cost. I mean no political impact for the government.
For the government.
It was not endangering their bilateral relationship with leading countries around the world.
I see.
It was not endangering their FDI capability. It was not endangering their credibility vis-a-vis their own taxpayers in the country.
Even though the dispute was costing millions, but of course in the context...
Nobody knew. Until I started working on it, nobody knew.
Nobody knew.
Then I made it public. Then it became a big scandal. So
then it became an issue.
I created a lot of issues for that government, a lot. And eventually that led the government to, after they understood that they had lost the legal battle, after they understood that there was a corruption scheme, then I created a lot of problems for the government, and that convinced the government that they needed to settle. And this is when then I sent some high-level negotiators to negotiate directly with them and to reach a deal. But this example illustrates something very important, is that if you don't understand how your opponents are operating, what they have in mind, what is motivating them, you cannot find a way to influence them. So intelligence is key in everything we do, because if you have the wrong intelligence, you take the wrong decision.
And that's why, in my view, I don't know whether you would agree, the question of who controls social media and what kind of regulation, which there isn't any at the moment or any meaningful, is so important, because if you divide the world in between people that are just digesting social media that has been curated by party A, and then you want them to get on with the other part of the world that is digesting media curated by party B, and they are both, and they become more and more extreme, you're going to have real problems socially and politically, aren't you?
Yeah, I think we're facing massive issues here. One is about the ownership of these platforms, which have a huge impact on the way their algorithm is designed, and therefore the type of content politically that is promoted. And we're seeing that on some social platforms.
Yeah.
That's one thing. The other thing that is, in my opinion, even more dangerous is the fact that social media have created millions of information bubbles that are not connected one another.
Or to reality.
Yeah. So at the beginning, the big slogan of Facebook, it was about connecting people, But actually, the social media are disconnecting us because we all operate in our own bubble. And therefore, we have lost access to information that is not aligned with what we think. Because the news feed that you will receive on your social media are exactly aligned with what you want to hear and your beliefs, your set of beliefs. And therefore, we have lost the ability to understand that there are other data, other information out there that says things completely different. And we have lost the ability to disagree because we are just surrounded, we are just operating in safe space where nobody disagrees with us. And that's extraordinarily dangerous for anybody who operates an organization, but also for a country. Because as long as we're not able to debate and to agree to disagree, we've got a big issue. And I think this is probably the biggest challenge of the coming decades for our Western democracies.
So we're both completely aligned on that, but you are going to tell me how we solve that problem. I hope.
Not sure. Not sure. I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer, Gary.
It's got to be. I mean, the issue of some people would say, well, the government ought to control and regulate social media and what you and I hear and see on a public basis. And then you have the problem of course, governments have this rather interesting tendency to promote or to use their agenda to promote what they want. And so even that itself is not a guarantee as impartiality. So where do you and I, where do you get your reliable, accurate news from?
So my newspaper of reference is the FT.
Right.
But I also look at other sources, and it's always interesting to see, looking at media from different parts of the world, about how they treat similar events and with completely different approaches. And that's when you start realizing that even the media you trust the most, like I trust the FT, has huge bias. We all are reading information that comes from people who have huge bias. So it would be a mistake to believe that what the Economist newspaper says is actually the absolute truth. It is very good quality, but it has a huge bias, like everything else we read.
So, and do you think that applies also to financial analysts and people like that they're, and I think it must do when you look at the fact that some economists disagree vehemently with each other as to whether there's a boom or a bust coming or whatever. So this bias is built into any kind of, I don't know, analysis of any intelligence, isn't it?
Oh, look at what has been the trajectory of the financial markets over the last 9 months in the United States. And you will see that suddenly everybody thinks that, we've got a glorious future thanks to Trump's election. And then everybody just, all the markets collapse. And then, eventually there's hope. And then again, it collapses. I mean, we spend our time doing U-turns, and depending on who you're asking the information, you get completely contradictory messages. I remember organizing a debate where I brought an extraordinarily prominent and authoritative economist to Davos just before the 2008 financial crisis, and who explained us with fantastic series of arguments why the real estate issue in the United States will not extend to the rest of the world, and why there will be no global financial crisis. That's life. You just need to be aware that there are some other people out there with different opinion and different set of data, and you need to proactively seek disagreements. You need to proactively challenge your views and always think, am I really right to think that?
And along the way, particularly at the levels that you've been operating, which is quite a unique level in the context of the investigation intelligence industry players that I've met, being connected with governments at the level you are, how does it affect the way that you look at the world? You've explained, of course, this sycophancy and this difficulty in getting people at the top to actually have disruptors or gainsayers in the room. But has it made you more jaundiced in terms of the way in which the politics and the politicians work? Has it made you more, I don't know, I guess more sanguine about the prospects for humanity?
No, it's your decision to look at the glass half full or half empty. And I think it's very important to not to be naive about the way organizations and governments operate, how much democracies can be inefficient, how much authoritarian regime can create chaos and suffering for their people. So coming into situations with open eyes is a healthy attitude. After that, I think it's very important that you have a personal discipline and routine to always look at what gives hope and the positive news around. So don't be naive about the challenges, but also don't get overwhelmed by it. That's the reason why I refuse to watch telly, because telly is just sending me images of violence and wars. Because when people fall in love, it's not making the headlines. The only thing that is making the headlines is when somebody stabs another person because they don't love anymore. So the way the media is constructed around negative news. So if you don't protect yourself from that negativity, then it has a big impact on your mental well-being and therefore on your capability to actually make change within your organization and with your clients. So,
and to make change within yourself, because you start to have these fixed ideas that something is actually, and it's subliminal, isn't it, when you're watching these programs?
Absolutely. So I think it's very important to develop a self-discipline to always look at what is good while not being naive about the failures.
So how long is it since you have used the remote control to, or do you still watch movies and things like that, but just not TV?
I watch movies, I watch movies, I watch TV series, I can watch some videos, but I haven't been watching telly for the last 10, 15 years.
And what about
at least 15 years?
And the family? Is it something that your whole family have adopted, or it's just your particular choice not to?
No. The family is aligned on that. You need to regain control of your own mental health.
Yes.
And what is the worst thing that giving power to others to actually go into your brain and invade you with images of hatred and violence? You don't give this power to anyone. You need to protect yourself.
I guess, and instinctively, it's something that I have been doing for as long as I can remember, which is why I love movies. I love to be taken away into a la-la land of imaginary things. So it doesn't matter what I see on the screen. I know it's not real, and I know it's just a distraction.
Absolutely.
And I'm interested in the extent to which you've seen intelligence agencies in different parts of the world operate. What impression has it left you as to the quality of intelligence gathering? You read about, of course, the Mossad and the recent exercise in Iran, when some of the intelligence they acquired there was just quite stunning. What's your view, and is there any particular aspect of intelligence gathering that you are familiar with and or you've seen used to good or bad ends?
I think there are two questions that are different here. One is the quality of the information that is gathered. And the second question is how this information is used. And the way this information is used doesn't depend from the intelligence service. This is the political decisions. And with all the weaknesses and challenges and contradiction that there can be. And I think that's one of the biggest issues of intelligence agencies in the world, is that their job is to gather intelligence. How this information is used is a completely different ballgame, on which they have very little influence. And I think that's one of the big challenge.
And talk to me a bit about examples where you've seen intelligence gathered and the action taken afterwards being completely, either deliberately, consciously, ignoring that intelligence at certain levels. You've come across, I'm sure, many situations where somebody, you said, look, this is what the intelligence is saying is guiding what you should do. And yet the leader says, you know what? No, I don't believe any of that. I'm going to do this.
Well, I'm sorry, just turn on the telly and listen to what the US president is saying every day. And
but
that's
what
a
about
perfect illustration between what we know is happening on the ground and what is the political reaction.
I'm trying to, not very elegantly, bring that into your personal experience where you've been advising leaders.
I will not go there.
Fair enough. And tell me about the way in which can you teach somebody how to, other than in the services, how do you teach? How do people learn in Highgate how to gather intelligence, how to develop their contacts? Do you do training courses? Do you bring people from, I know you do, from places where they've had training themselves, but still there must be a continuum of training within Highgate and trying to keep that quality?
So a few things here. First, Highgate is not an intelligence firm. We work a lot with intelligence. We work a lot with intelligence firms, but we're not an intelligence firm ourselves. And I'm not an intelligence guy myself. I'm an engineer by background, and I was not in the services. Second, we have quite a few of our colleagues who come from either private or public intelligence agencies. And that's very important for the work we're doing and for the way we're advising our clients, mostly corporates. And these are people who have learned the intelligence work the hard way throughout their career. And they bring that level of competence and expertise, which allows then us to work with corporate intelligence in a much more efficient way, because we're able to ask the right question, challenge them, and help our clients make sense out of it. The biggest difference you have between private intelligence and public intelligence is that in private intelligence, it tends to be the same people who gather the intelligence and who make the recommendations. Whereas in the public intelligence, you have a very strict distinction between the people who gather the intelligence and the people who then analyze it and challenge it. And that's very important, because the way you collect the information would create a huge bias, very often unconscious, emotional, about whether you believe this information is true or not. And actually, it's always important to have a second layer of cold analysis, challenging the different information, intersecting them, and seeing what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. There's one case where we were working for a corporate client on a very, very complex and hostile environment, and our client was receiving intelligence report from a very renowned intelligence firm, and that the client had hired, and then they hired us to see how we can use this intelligence and what to make out of it and how to find a solution in resolving this conflict. And we very quickly came to the conclusion, when I say we, I mean my consultants, not myself, but my consultants who have worked in private intelligence agencies and public intelligence agency, they came to the conclusion that actually these intelligence reports were highly biased, or even more biased. They were actually dishonest.
Wow.
Simply because looking at the fact that questioning the outcome of this report, my team came to the conclusion that the local person who was providing intelligence was actually blackmailed by the government to provide a certain picture because they wanted to manipulate a client in a certain way. So the intelligence reports were actually directed by their opponents.
Wow.
But that requires real competence in understanding the dynamic, in knowing how the intelligence is gathered to be able to realize that. And we said that to the client, and the client was a bit skeptical. And eventually we proved it, A plus 1 plus 1, that indeed it was the case. And that was extremely important because then the clients took a very different stand vis-a-vis this information that was sent to them, and therefore we had a very different course of action. Again, if you put the wrong data into the system, you get the wrong outcome.
And so this world of intelligence and counterintelligence is fascinating, and a world I guess I've chosen to live in. But how many times have you come across that kind of situation where your client's opponent is actually consciously looking to compromise the way in which the opponent gathers intelligence? Is it like every case you get that level of sophistication?
No, it's not every case. It happens rarely, but it happens. But it also happens sometimes that we are the one feeding the wrong information to the other side.
So I know we're getting close to the witching hour. So give me another example of something unique or just either amusing or highly effective that you and your team have done that converted a good position into a excellent position or a bad position into a good position.
I mean, there are plenty of war stories, but one that I like is a massive global dispute against a Russian oligarch, where the Russian guy was on the wrong side of history, but was refusing to settle. And the only way I managed to compel him to settle was to create a very tangible threat that he would be put by the US government on the US sanction list. And the moment he understood this was a very serious threat, he came to the negotiation table and he signed a deal.
And by definition, it was something that your client could actually do. It was a real threat rather than a bluff.
I would not comment on that.
And a closing question that is not a war story. Out of all of the leaders, both in public and private life, you've met, and what would be the single lesson that you would want them to learn, for the next generation of leaders to learn from all of the disasters of, and maybe some of the good decisions of the leaders that you've met? What would be the thing you would want the new generation of leaders to take away with them?
If you want to change the world, you have to start by changing yourself.
I have
And that's the hardest thing. And I see so many people pretending to change the world, and actually they are the essence of what the problem is. So the hard work starts with oneself.
Self-development, that's the message.
Yeah.
Another time we will get into what kind of things you do, and maybe I do, in order to make sure we're constantly self-developing. But our time has come to an end. I'm so grateful to you, Thomas, for spending time with me. I know you've got clients banging down the door, but thank you. And I've really enjoyed it. Take care.
Thank you, Gary. Ciao. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please click and subscribe to the Intelligence Advantage podcast on Spotify and other platforms.